The hall of trials glowed with light that seemed to pour from the very bones of the palace. Tall pillars shimmered with threads of crystal, casting reflections across the polished floor. Banners of many worlds hung above, their colors bright, but trembling in the air as if they knew the weight of what happened in this place. At the center, on a throne carved from dark stone and rimmed with silver, sat Princess Kalira. She wore armor that gleamed like a star, each piece shaped to show both grace and power. Her eyes, pale and cold, followed every movement before her with the sharpness of a blade. Before her, a dozen suitors knelt. They came from across the galaxy, warriors with scars on their faces, kings with jeweled crowns, thinkers who carried books bound in metal, beasts wrapped in heavy furs. All had come with one purpose: to prove themselves in her trials, and to claim the right to stand beside her throne. Yet one by one, they had failed. A giant from the war clans had fallen during the duel of strength. Kalira had not even risen from her throne. She only raised a hand, and her guards struck the signal. The duel began, and in moments the warrior was crushed to his knees, his pride broken. When he looked up, she leaned forward only enough to whisper her single word of judgment: defeated. Another came with riddles, his tongue quick as lightning, his mind sharper than most blades. He recited verses from forgotten books. He posed questions that twisted in circles. Kalira listened in silence, her face still as stone. When he reached his last question, her answer was a single phrase. The riddle master froze, lips parted, unable to counter her calm reply. She lifted her hand, and again the word left her lips like frost: defeated. An endurance trial followed, the suitors thrown into the gauntlet of fire and shadow where the body was pushed beyond its limits. Hours passed, sweat dripping from their brows, knees shaking. Kalira watched with no change in her eyes. When one suitor collapsed, gasping, she turned her gaze away and let the silence speak until the guards carried him out. This was her power. Not only her beauty, not only her crown, but the silence that wrapped her like armor. The court had long whispered about it. She never spoke outside of the trials. She never wasted words on comfort or greeting. When she spoke, it was only to mark the end of another suitor's hope. That silence made her untouchable, above all games of flattery or charm. On this day, the air in the hall felt thicker than usual. The failures had stacked like stones, each one heavier than the last. Courtiers exchanged glances. No one dared say it aloud, but a shadow of fear crept into the chamber. What if no one could ever break her trials? What if no one could ever stand beside her? And then came the whisper that cut through the tension like a spark in dry grass. A human envoy is arriving. The word spread quickly through the crowd. Laughter followed almost at once. Suitors from powerful species smirked, their pride feeding on the thought. Humans were spoken of as weak, fragile, too soft for the brutality of the trials. They broke easily, both in body and spirit. Some courtiers muttered that it would be amusing, at least, to watch a human fail even faster than the others. Kalira sat unmoved as the sound rippled through her court. Her eyes were fixed ahead, calm and sharp. Yet when the words reached her, a human, there was the faintest flicker. It was not a smile, not a frown, but a shift, like a ripple disturbing still water. Her fingers tightened slightly against the armrest of her throne. No one else noticed, but the silence inside her stretched, deeper than ever. For the first time in many years, something in her heart stirred. The human arrived, not with the thunder of drums or the cry of banners, but with quiet steps that echoed across the marble floor. His cloak was plain, a muted gray, and his hands were empty of weapons. He was not tall compared to the towering lords of other worlds, nor wrapped in muscle like the champions who had already fallen. Yet when he walked into the hall, his posture was steady, his gaze unshaken, and his silence was not the silence of fear, it was the silence of someone who knew exactly why he had come. The courtiers whispered louder now, their laughter sharp. like knives. Fragile creature, some muttered. He will not last a breath. Others leaned forward, hungry to see him crumble beneath the princess's trials. Princess Kalira leaned her cheek against her fist, her pale eyes narrowing as she studied him. His skin was not armored, his body not wrapped in protective suits. His hair fell loosely at his brow, and when he finally lifted his head, his eyes met hers with a calm so unshakable it unsettled even her guards. The herald's voice rose, booming through the crystalline hall, presenting Elias Cross, envoy of humanity, seeker of the trial. Elias bowed deeply, not with the arrogance of one who thought himself equal, but with a quiet grace that spoke of respect. Then, instead of waiting for the trial to be called, he raised his voice. It was not loud, but it carried clearly through the chamber. "Princess," he said, "I did not come here to win you as a prize. I came to understand you." Gasps rose at once, sharp and scandalized. One suitor barked out a laugh. "Fool, does he not know this is the hall of trials? The princess breaks men like him before she takes her morning meal." Yet Elias did not flinch. He stood with hands folded calmly before him, his face serene. His voice had no tremor, no desperation. Kalira's eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. She straightened, her armor shimmering like a blade catching fire. Her silence pressed heavy across the room, a silence that for years had broken proud men more than any sword. But Elias did not look away. Finally she raised her hand, and the trial master stepped forward. "The gauntlet of chains," the master declared, his voice low and grim. "Let him be bound, and see if his fragile human body endures." Guards moved quickly, pulling chains forged of alien alloys that had bent even the strongest of warriors. They wrapped them around Elias's wrists, shoulders, and chest, pulling him down to his knees. The crowd leaned forward eagerly, waiting to see him strain, waiting for the sound of bone breaking. But he did not resist. He lowered himself willingly, his breath calm, his eyes still fixed on hers. "Why do you not fight?" one of the courtiers hissed, anger lacing his voice. Elias turned his head slightly, his words soft but clear. "Because the chains are not the trial. The true trial sits upon the throne, and she has been chained far longer than I." The court froze. Silence rippled, heavy and strange. Even Kalira's breath caught in her throat. She rose slightly from her throne, her voice sharp as ice. "Speak carefully, human. Do you dare to say I am bound?" His eyes softened, though his body trembled faintly under the weight of the chains. Not by iron, not by stone, but by silence. Silence can be heavier than any shackle. The words sank into the hall like arrows. The courtiers shifted uneasily, some muttering, others staring in disbelief. No one had spoken to her like this, not in years. No one had dared. Kalira's jaw tightened. She should have ordered his punishment, should have cast him out as she had with so many others. Yet there was something in his voice that held her still, something that pressed against the walls she had built around her heart. She stepped down from the throne, her armor echoing with each movement. The court held its breath as she approached him. Standing before him, she leaned closer, her eyes sharp as fire. "You claim to understand silence," she whispered, her voice low, dangerous, "yet you know nothing of it. Silence is strength, human. Silence is power." Elias looked up at her, sweat glistening at his temples, the chains biting into his skin. Still, his voice did not break, or silence his loneliness. "Only you know which it is." The words pierced her deeper than any blade. For the first time in many years, Princess Kalira felt the certainty of her silence tremble. She turned sharply, her cloak swirling, and signaled to the guards, "Release him." Gasps rose. No one was ever released until they were broken. Yet the chains fell away, clattering to the floor. Elias stood slowly, stretching his bruised wrists, but never once. Lowering his gaze from hers, Kalira returned to her throne, sitting with careful grace. her lips pressed together, her heart beating faster than she wished to admit. The court erupted in whispers, confusion burning in their eyes. And then came the final spark of suspense. The words spoken from the corner of the hall by an elder courtier. If this human is not broken today, then perhaps none of us ever will be. The air shifted. The trials, once certain, now trembled, and Kalira, known for her eternal silence, felt a question form on her tongue, one she had no intention of asking aloud. Not yet, but her eyes betrayed it, flickering with something dangerous, curiosity. The morning after the human's trial, the palace corridors thrummed with restless voices. The courtiers had not slept. They whispered in corners, argued in chambers, their tongues tripping over disbelief. Never before had a suitor left the hall without being broken. Never before had Princess Kalira ended a trial with unfinished silence. The rumor spread like fire through dry grass. Some said the human was a coward who had tricked her with words. Others said he was dangerous, that his calmness hid a power unseen. A few, quieter than the rest, wondered if perhaps the silence of the princess had finally cracked. Kalira heard every murmur, though none dared speak in her presence. She sat at her throne that morning in full armor, her face set in its usual cold mask. But inside, her heart beat in a rhythm she had not felt since childhood. She hated that it beat faster when she thought of him. Elias Cross stood again in the hall. No chains bound him now, no weapons gleamed in his hands. He looked as plain as before, his cloak falling simply over his shoulders. Yet there was a weight to his presence that silenced even the boldest whispers. The master of trials approached Kalira. Princess, the next test awaits. What command shall you give this fragile envoy? Kalira's lips parted, as if to speak the word that always came easily defeated. But the sound caught in her throat. She could not declare him defeated. She had seen his eyes the night before, calm even under chains. She had heard his voice cut through the laughter of her court, daring to name her silence a burden. Instead, she leaned back, her voice soft but sharp. The labyrinth of echoes. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. The labyrinth was a place carved deep beneath the palace, a twisting maze where the walls themselves whispered illusions. It had broken many warriors, turning their minds against them until they begged for release. Guards led Elias to the gates of the labyrinth, heavy stone doors etched with glowing runes. He glanced once toward the throne, his gaze meeting hers. For the first time Kalira felt heat rise in her chest. Though her face remained cold, the doors opened, and Elias stepped inside. The stone sealed behind him with a rumble. The hall waited. Within the labyrinth, the air was thick and heavy. The walls gleamed faintly, alive with strange whispers. Voices of suitors passed, mocking and cruel, filled the air. You are weak. You do not belong. You will fail. Elias paused at the first fork, his hand brushing against the wall. The whispers grew louder, pressing into his ears, twisting around his thoughts. But he closed his eyes and breathed slowly. These are not my voices, he murmured. They do not belong to me. He chose his path with quiet steps, turning not by instinct but by stillness, pausing to listen for the one thread of silence within the storm of echoes. Back in the hall, the courtiers grew restless. Some chuckled, certain he would be broken within minutes. Others cast wary glances at Kalira, as if searching her face for signs of doubt. She gave them none. Her eyes stayed fixed on the sealed gates, her silence unreadable. Minutes passed, then an hour, then another. No sound came from the labyrinth. The court began to fidget. Even the trial master shifted uneasily. Finally, with a heavy groan, the gates of stone creaked open. Elias stepped out. His cloak was torn. His brow glistened with sweat, but his steps were steady. The whispers clung faintly to him, like shadows trying to drag him back. Yet, when he reached the center of the hall, he lifted his head and said simply, I heard the voices of all who came before. but I chose to hear only one, the one who has not spoken. His eyes met Kalira's. Her chest tightened. He was speaking of her. Gasps broke across the hall. Some suitors shouted in protest. Trickery, they cried. He has cheated the trial. Kalira raised her hand, and at once the chamber fell into silence. Her eyes stayed locked on his, cold but burning beneath the surface. Explain, she demanded, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. Elias bowed his head slightly. Every warrior who entered that maze believed they had to fight the voices. But silence is not a battle, it is a choice. I walked until I heard nothing but quiet, and in that quiet, I thought of you. The hall froze. The air itself seemed to stop moving. Kale Ira single quotes as fingers tightened on the armrest of her throne. She should have ended it there, should have cut him down with the word that had always ended the trials. Yet the word would not come. Her silence trembled, and for the first time, the courtiers saw it. Later that night, when the hall had emptied and the suitors had gone, Kalira stood alone on the balcony of her chamber. The stars burned silver against the endless black sky. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she heard his voice again in her mind. Silence is not a battle, it is a choice. Her lips parted, the whisper rising unbidden. A name she had not meant to speak, Elias, but the night swallowed the sound, leaving her alone with the echo of her own voice, shaken, uncertain, alive. The following day dawned heavy with expectation. The palace itself seemed restless, as if the walls had learned to breathe. Courtiers filled the hall early, whispering in tight clusters, their eyes darting toward the sealed gates where the human had survived what no one else had. Whispers turned into wagers. Some swore the princess would finally crush him. Others whispered he might be a danger to her throne. And yet none dared say aloud what many felt, that the silence around Princess Kalira was shifting, trembling like glass under a hidden crack. When Kalira entered the hall, her armor glowed beneath the rising light. Her every step rang with authority, yet her thoughts were unsettled. Through the long corridors of the night, she had replayed his words, his calm gaze, his refusal to treat her silence as a weapon, but instead as a wound. She told herself it meant nothing, yet when she took her seat on the throne, her eyes sought him instantly. Elias Cross entered without fanfare, as plain and calm as before. He bowed, and when he lifted his head, his gaze was steady, almost gentle. Kalira felt heat curl in her chest, quickly smothered beneath her mask. The trial master approached, eager to reclaim the court's order. "Princess," he said, his voice loud, "the suitor has survived the labyrinth of echoes. What trial will you set today?" Kalira's lips curved, a dangerous glimmer in her pale eyes. "The Feast of Masks," she declared. A ripple of shock spread through the hall. The Feast of Masks was not of strength or endurance, it was of truth. Every suitor invited to dine with the princess beneath the eyes of the court, where questions were sharp as blades and answers judged harsher than any wound. None had lasted beyond the third question. The tables were set quickly, glimmering with crystal cups and golden plates. Dishes from 100 worlds steamed in the air, their scents twisting together. Kalira sat at the head, regal, untouchable. Elias was placed opposite her, a lone figure at a sea of hostile stares. The questions began. The lord of the court leaned forward, his mask carved in the shape of a hawk. "Human," he sneered, "why come here when your kind is nothing but dust? To the stars. What makes you think you can stand where giants have fallen?" Elias lifted his cup, his hand steady. "Because giants fall," he said softly. "Dust endures. It drifts, it travels, it becomes part of everything." The hall stirred. Some scoffed, but others fell into uneasy silence. A second question came from a warrior cloaked in crimson. "If you were offered the throne, would you take it? Would you wear our crown?" Elias's gaze shifted toward Kalira. His answer was quiet, almost too quiet, yet every ear strained to hear it. No crown can be won by chains or trials, only by trust. If she does not give it freely, then it is worth nothing to me. Kalira's fingers tightened against her goblet. Her heart betrayed her, beating faster at the calm defiance of his words. The third question came, sharp and cruel. If the princess herself ordered your death, what would you say in your last breath? The court leaned forward, hungry for his stumble. Elias placed his hands on the table, leaning slightly forward, his gaze fixed on the woman who had not spoken to him beyond commands. I would say her name, because no silence, not even death, should pass without truth being spoken once. The air froze. Kalira's mask cracked just slightly, but enough. Her lips parted, though no sound came. Her silence trembled again. The trial master rose to declare him broken, certain that his calm must be a disguise. But Kalira raised her hand, her voice slicing through the hall. Enough. The word echoed. The feast was ended. That night, she did not retreat to her throne room or chambers. Instead, she walked the hidden gardens behind the palace, where silver trees glowed faintly and fountains whispered like forgotten songs. And there, she found Elias already waiting, standing by the fountain's edge. You knew I would come, she said, her voice sharper than she intended. He did not bow this time. He only turned, his eyes steady. I hoped you would. For a moment, neither spoke. The night pressed close, heavy with unspoken tension. The princess who had lived in silence found her tongue restless, her heart louder than any trial drum. Finally, she asked, why do you not fear me? His answer was simple, because I see you, not the trials, not the throne, only you. Her chest ached, her breath caught, but she turned quickly away, unwilling to let him see how deeply his words cut, unseen in the shadows. A pair of courtiers watched, their eyes wide with suspicion. Whispers would spread before dawn whispers, far more dangerous than any trial. For the first time, Kalira felt not power but risk in breaking her silence. And yet, for the first time, she also wanted to. The court did not sleep that night. The shadows carried whispers faster than light, and by dawn, the palace burned with suspicion. Courtiers gathered in secret, voices sharp with fear. They spoke of betrayal, of weakness. The alien princess who had once shattered warriors with silence was now trembling, and all because of a human who had spoken too softly, too boldly. By the time the hall filled again, tension was thick as iron chains. When Princess Kalira entered, the air quivered around her. Her armor glowed with cold fire, her face unreadable. Yet beneath that mask, her heart was restless, beating against the walls she had built for years. Elias stood waiting. He bowed as always, calm and steady, but his eyes lingered on her, a heartbeat too long. The court saw it, and their unease deepened. The trial master approached, his voice low, almost desperate. Princess, the time has come. This human cannot remain unbroken. Give him the storm of voices. Gasps followed the words. Even among the most brutal trials, the storm was feared. It was not chains, not blades, not fire. It was sound itself, thousands of voices screaming, mocking, howling, until the strongest minds shattered. No one had lasted beyond a single hour. Kalira hesitated, her lips parting. She looked at Elias. His face was calm, his breath steady, and she knew he would not beg. He would not resist either. He would simply endure. Her heart clenched, but she gave the order. Let the storm begin. The chamber was transformed. The suitor's dais was stripped bare, surrounded by crystal amplifiers. The walls began to hum, alive with stored voices of the fallen. They poured into the air in waves, roaring, mocking, accusing. Elias stepped inside the circle. At once, the storm hit him. Voices shrieked from every side. Frail human, worthless dust. You do not belong here. She will never choose you. You are Nothing. His body shook, his head bowed. The court leaned forward eagerly, waiting for his knees to collapse. But then he lifted his face. His eyes were closed, but his lips moved, and his voice was soft. I hear only one voice. The storm raged louder. The amplifiers shrieked, pressing against his mind like blades. Sweat slid down his temples, his hands trembled. Still, his voice whispered through the roar. I hear only her. Kalira's breath caught. The storm should have drowned him, should have broken him as it had broken kings. Yet somehow, his words reached her throne, slipping through the noise like arrows of light. Her fingers dug into the armrest. She wanted to rise, to end it, but the court was watching. They needed to see him crushed. Minutes stretched like hours. Elias swayed, his cloak soaked in sweat, his body trembling with strain. But his voice did not falter. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is choice. I choose hers. The storm faltered. For the first time in the history of the trial, the voices wavered, uncertain. The amplifiers cracked, a piercing hum splitting the chamber. With a final shudder, the storm collapsed into silence. Elias fell to one knee, his breath ragged. Yet, when he lifted his head, his eyes were clear. Your silence, he said hoarsely, is the only one I will hear. The court erupted. Shouts of anger, fear, disbelief. He is a trickster, they cried. No human should endure the storm. Others whispered of danger, that his endurance was sorcery, that his words were poison to the throne. Kalira rose, her cloak sweeping behind her. The court fell silent at once. She stepped down, her boots echoing against the floor, and stopped before him. For a moment, she only looked at him. His body shook from exhaustion, but his gaze never wavered. His silence now was stronger than the storm itself. She should have declared him broken. Instead, she turned sharply toward the court. Enough, she commanded. Gasps rippled. Never had she spared a suitor at the storm. Her voice rang like steel. This trial is ended. The courtiers bowed, some in fear, some in fury, but as they obeyed, their eyes glimmered with a new danger plots forming, whispers sharpening. That night, Kalira walked her private chambers restlessly. The storm still rang faintly in her ears, but louder than all was his voice. I hear only her. When she finally stepped onto her balcony, he was there again, waiting in the shadows. You should not be here, she said, though her voice lacked. Forsey smiled faintly, his face pale with exhaustion, but his eyes still burning. Then, send me away. She could not. Her lips parted, and for the first time in years, her voice trembled. Why do you speak like this? Why risk yourself? His answer was quiet, because silence should never be a cage. Not for you. Her breath caught. She turned her face away, hiding the heat in her eyes. But the moment was not hidden from all. Deep in the gardens below, spies of the court watched with narrowed eyes. By dawn, the whispers would no longer be whispers. They would be daggers aimed at both of them. The palace had never known such unrest. Corridors once filled with quiet ceremony now thrummed with tension like the strings of a bow pulled too tight. Whispers turned into plots, and plots into secret gatherings. Courtiers, suitors, and generals met in hushed corners, their voices dripping with fear and fury. She is breaking, one hissed. No, she is being broken, another replied. By a human, a third spat, as if the word itself was poison. Their fear was not just for the throne, it was for the balance of pride itself. If the alien princess, the silent jewel of their people, could be moved by the gentleness of one fragile envoy, then every fortress they had built upon arrogance would crumble. That night, when the court slept uneasily, Princess Kalira did not. She paced her chamber like a caged storm, her armor set aside, her silken gown catching the glow of the starlight. Her silence pressed against her chest heavier than ever, because it was no longer hers alone. He had touched it. He had spoken into it. And worse, she had listened. A sound at her balcony made her spin sharply. Her guards were not there, she had dismissed them hours ago. But she did not need guards, for she already knew who stood beyond the pillars. Elias. He did not bow this time. He stepped forward into the glow of the moons, his cloak falling back from his shoulders. He looked tired, the storm of voices still etched in the lines of his face, but his eyes were steady. "You risk much coming here," she said, her tone colder than she felt. "So do you, by letting me," he answered. The words stilled her. For a long moment, neither moved. The only sound was the whisper of the wind through the silver trees below. Finally, she turned away, gripping the railing of the balcony so tightly her knuckles paled. "You do not understand," she said. "Silence is my strength. It is the wall that keeps me above them all. Without it, they will devour me. They will devour everything." "Silence is not strength," Ilias said softly, stepping closer. "It is survival. Strength is the courage to speak when your voice shakes." His nearness unsettled her more than any suitor's blade. She turned sharply, ready to cut him with words, but instead found herself trapped by his gaze. No hunger, no ambition, only truth. "Why do you keep saying these things?" she asked, her voice breaking like glass. He paused. "Because someone must remind you that you are not a prize. You are a person, and I will not stop until you believe it." Her heart pounded. She hated it, feared it, but could not escape it. For years, she had wielded silence like a sword, but now it cut against her, leaving her trembling. Then, without meaning to, without planning it, her lips parted, and the words slipped out, barely a breath, yet heavier than all the trials combined. Ilias. His eyes softened, and for the first time since he had arrived, he reached out. Not in command, not in demand, but in simple offering. His hand brushed against hers, warm, steady. The world seemed to stop, but far below. In the shadows of the gardens, spies listened. One hurried away, carrying the whisper that would soon ignite the court into open rebellion. The following morning, the storm broke. The court demanded an answer. The princess, they said, had betrayed her silence. She had betrayed her trials. She had allowed a human to stand unbroken where kings had fallen. The great hall swelled with voices, furious and wild. The trial master himself stepped forward, his face grim. "Princess," he declared, "for the honor of the throne, for the honor of your people, you must cast him down. If you will not, then we will." Gasps filled the hall. Courtiers pressed forward, some with daggers hidden in sleeves, others with fury in their eyes. Kalira rose from her throne, her cloak flaring behind her. Her silence was louder than the crowd's fury, pressing them into stillness. But this time, her silence was not cold, trembled, alive, dangerous. Elias stood at her side. For once he did not speak. He simply waited, his presence steady, his eyes only on her, and for the first time in her life, Princess Kalira knew the choice before her was not about trials or thrones. It was about whether she would let the silence remain her cage or shatter it forever. Her lips parted. The court leaned forward, waiting for her judgment. The great hall quaked with voices that clashed like blades, a storm of fury and disbelief. Courtiers shouted over one another, their fear of shame louder than their loyalty to the throne. Armored suitors gripped their weapons, half drawing them, in rage, while the trial master's staff struck against the marble floor, demanding order that never came. The air itself seemed to burn with tension. Princess Kalira stood at the center of it all, the storm crashing against her throne like a wave against stone. But for the first time, she did not hide behind silence. Her breath came sharp, her chest rising with something new, something more dangerous than her silence had ever been. The court's cry rose together. "Cast him down, break the human, break him as you have broken all." Elias remained still at her side, his cloak draped like the wings of a quiet shadow. His eyes never left hers, even as hatred and weapons turned toward him. He knew this was the moment. Either her silence would cage her forever, or she would choose to shatter it. Her fingers curled around the armrest of her throne. She could hear her father's ghost in her memory, the lessons drilled into her youth. A ruler speaks rarely, for every word is a command. A ruler must be silence, for silence is untouchable. She had believed it for years. She had lived it, wielded it, mastered it. But as she looked at Elias fragile, exhausted, unbroken, she understood what silence had cost her. It had kept her feared, it had kept her powerful, but it had also kept her alone. She rose. The hall stilled. Courtiers froze mid-breath, waiting for the single word that would seal the human's fate. The silence stretched, sharper than any blade. Then her lips parted. Enough. The word rolled through the hall like thunder. Gasps filled the chamber. Not because she had spoken before, to deliver judgment. But this was different. Her voice was not the cold knife of defeat. It was fire, alive and unchained. She stepped forward, her cloak sweeping across the floor. Her gaze burned across the rows of courtiers. For years you believed my silence was power. You thought it unshakable, a weapon to keep you all beneath me. But you were wrong. The court shifted uneasily. The trial master frowned, his staff trembling in his grip. Kalira's voice rose, steady and fierce. My silence was not power. It was fear. Fear that if I spoke, you would twist my words. Fear that if I opened my heart, you would strike it. Fear that if I revealed myself, I would lose the throne my father gave his life to protect. Her hand lifted, pointing toward Elias. And yet this one, this human, dared to see that silence. He did not fear it. He did not worship it. He broke it not with strength, not with riddles, not with chains, but with truth. And for that, I break it now. The court erupted into shouts. Betrayal, weakness. She lowers herself for dust. Kalira's eyes flashed. Dust. She hissed, her voice cutting through the uproar. Dust is what remains when empires fall. Dust is what endures when pride is broken. And if you cannot see strength in humility, then you are weaker than the suitors you mocked. The hall shook with chaos, but her voice carried above it, commanding, undeniable. She turned to Elias. For a moment, the fire in her gaze softened. Elias Cross, she said, her voice trembling only at his name. You are not my suitor. You are not my prize. You are my equal. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm of voices had ever been. Her declaration shattered centuries of tradition in a single breath. The trial master dropped his staff, his voice breaking. This cannot be. The throne, Kalira cut in, will no longer be won by trials of cruelty. It will be built by choice, by trust, by truth. Her words struck like lightning. Half the court recoiled in outrage. The other half stared shaken, their certainty unraveling. For the first time, the people saw not a silent statue of power, but a living ruler who had chosen to speak. A dagger flashed from the crowd. One of the suitors lunged, roaring with rage. Then let your silence end in death. The blade cut through the air only to be caught by Elias. He had no weapon, no armor, but he moved with sudden force, twisting the strike away. The dagger clattered across the floor. The court gasped as guards rushed forward, dragging the suitor away. Elias stood there, chest heaving, his hand still shaking from the effort. He looked at Kalira. You do not need me to protect you, he said softly, but I will, if you let me. Her heart broke open. Without hesitation, she stepped toward him, and in front of the stunned court, she placed her hand over his. The hall was silent now, not because of fear, but because no one knew how to breathe in the face of what they had just witnessed. Kale, Ira, raised her head high, her voice strong. Let it be known, the trials are ended. My silence is ended. Today, a human broke what no warrior could, and in doing so, gave me back my voice. The declaration spread like fire, racing through the palace, the city, the stars. That night, when the court had scattered in shock, Kalira and Elias stood alone on the balcony. The sky above shimmered with endless constellations. For once, the silence between them was not a wall. It was a bridge. She leaned closer, her voice a whisper softer than the wind. Elias. He turned, his hand finding hers. Her lips trembled, with a truth she had never dared to speak. My silence was waiting for you. And then, for the first time in her life, the princess known for her silence let her voice fall into the night. Not as command, not as judgment, but as confession. The stars themselves seemed to hold their breath, as if they too had been waiting for her whisper.